Morning, and welcome to the last installment of our training for mitigation and DR, the environmental review. Kim and Allison, Kim Stiefer and Allison Anderson are our environmental review specialists, and so they'll be doing the presentation today, but I'm just going to give a friendly reminder to everyone to please mute your phones, mute your computers, or I'll do it for you. And then please use the chat function. We'll be using the chat function and monitoring it throughout the presentation. Or if you want to unmute yourselves, if you have a question during the presentation, that's fine as well. Just a reminder, these are being recorded and will be made available on our websites for both the disaster recovery and the mitigation website. Hopefully today, if not on Tuesday, because Monday's a holiday. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Kim to get started.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being on the call. I'm going to talk about environmental review requirements, and we'll try to answer any questions, and I'll turn it over to Allison about halfway through the presentation. She will finish it out. So next slide, please. And you can just go to the next slide. Okay, so environmental review is, we do it because of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, that was enacted in 1969. It's to ensure that federal agencies consider and address environmental impacts that result from activities and projects they sponsor. And so there are laws and requirements that have to be, you have to abide by. And the HUD has developed its own set of regulations to implement NEPA and additional environmental statutes. And this ensures a quality project, assures a safe, decent, and sanitary environment. It takes impacts on the environment into account and ensures a project is suitable for the activity or the project site. And it prevents time delays and cost overruns and avoids or mitigates environmental impacts that harm people and the surrounding environment. It also helps to avoid litigation that could stop a project in its tracks and avoids monitoring findings and sanctions, and it secures the value of public investment. And so it ensures the environmental information is available to the public before decisions are made and before actions are taken. It helps public officials make decisions with an understanding of environmental consequences. So the responsible entity is the unit of local government, and it is on them to perform the NEPA responsibility that would otherwise apply to HUD. So our program uses the Part 58 regulation. And as part of the CDBG grant agreement, the chief elected official of a jurisdiction assumes this responsibility and must sign the request for release of funds and certification. And it applies to all levels of federal funding and assistance. And it generally takes anywhere from, for more complex project, anywhere from 90 to 120 days. So make sure you build in enough time into your project timeline to complete your environmental review. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to talk about the ER process. This is a timeline that I will walk through and talk about each of these steps. So the first step is where you decide that you will attempt to apply for CDBG funds. And when this occurs, at application, you must stop all choice limiting actions until the ER is complete. And you can go to the next slide. So choice limiting actions are actions that reduce or eliminate the opportunity to choose alternatives. Hang on a second. So alternative, you need to consider other alternatives to the project, and then identify other reasonable courses of action that could be used or designed in another way. Just things that will prevent adverse impacts to the environment. And so at the time of application, all project activities must cease until the authority to use grant funds is issued, and that would be the completion of the environmental review. So things that need to halt at this time would include acquisition, rehabilitation, construction, and as well as contracting for or committing to any of these actions. And next slide, please. Okay, so the project description, you can go on the next slide. The project description is very important. It needs to include all related activities by all funding sources. So in addition to the activities that CDBG funds would pay for, it needs to include all other sources of funds, so activities that are being funded by the local government or by another federal agency all need to be included in this project scope. The level of review is determined by the scope as a whole. So you're taking into consideration the highest level of review for the actions that are in the project. You want to perform separate reviews for non-related activities. An example would be buyouts, if you're doing buyouts, and then also a rehab project, you would want to do separate reviews for those simply because they are not related activities. And then related activities that are not funded by CDBG are still subject to the environmental review requirements. Next slide, please. Alternative analysis is required for all environmental assessments. It should consider the environmental impacts of each possible alternative. You should examine and recommend feasible ways in which the project or external factors relating to the project could be modified in order to eliminate or minimize adverse environmental impacts. And you also should identify other reasonable courses of action, explain them and how they were considered and not selected, such as other sites or design modifications or other uses of the subject site. And you should also include benefits and adverse impacts to the environment for each alternative and the reasons for rejecting it. And you also need to consider the no action alternative. What would happen if this project did not occur? You would want to explain the results of taking no action. Next slide, please.
Can I stop for just a second, Kim, and make a comment?
Yes.
It seems that somebody's trying to use the raise the hand function, and we don't really operate that way. So if you have a question or a comment, go ahead and unmute yourself or use the chat function. We're able to monitor that a lot easier. If you're a call-in user, I believe you can *6 to unmute yourself. And if you're on your computer or phone, you should be able to use the unmute button at the bottom. Otherwise, throw it in the chat. I apologize. We just aren't functioning the best with the raise the hand function yet. So thank you.
Okay. So the next thing is to determine the level of environmental review. Next slide, please. So in the regulation, Part 58, there is definitions for the different levels of environmental review. Also, this information is in our environmental review chapter of the CDBG admin manual, which is available on our website. And additionally, the HUD Exchange has a lot of good information about the entire environmental review process and what's required. So your different levels of review, the exempt is the most simple. It would be for activities such as administration, planning, design, and environmental studies. So it's activities that have no effect on the human or physical environment. And this is just a 1 or 2 page form that would need to be completed and filled out. The CENST is the next level. It is categorically excluded, not subject to Part 58. And it pertains to activities that do not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect. So this is where you would find things such as rental assistance or home buyer assistance, your down payment assistance. And then CEST is categorically excluded subject to, and this might have a limited effect. It applies to anything like a less than 20% change to infrastructure, limited rehab, demo and acquisition, and ADA improvement. It's where you have no change in land use. And then the EA is anything beyond what is listed under the other categories. So the EA is usually what we see as the highest level of review, most comprehensive review, and takes the longest amount of time. But this is where you're going to find things such as like water projects and reconstruction, new construction, that sort of thing. The EIS is not something that we really work with in this program, simply because our projects don't reach that level. You would do an EIS if the environmental assessment says there's a finding of significant impact. And so then you would have to jump up to the EIS. And I've only seen an EIS one time, and that was when they rebuilt the hospital in Joplin after the tornado. And that was a really big project. So probably not going to see that here. Okay, next slide, please. So then this is where you get into preparing the actual environmental review record, and you're collecting your documentation. You're doing your consultations, you're doing your statutory checklist, and filling out the forms. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in doing the statutory checklist, we do have the checklist itself on our website, and this is a helpful tool that tells you the documentation that should be included in your record. And I use this checklist. I think Allison and I both use this checklist when we review these environmental reviews to make sure that they include all the information here. And also the CDBG Environmental Review Impact Determination Guide on our website is a very good tool for explaining in detail the requirements that are on the statutory checklist, and then telling you the sort of documentation you should have, and also asking specific questions that you should consider or explain in your narrative. And so I highly recommend using both of those documents as you're preparing your environmental review. So the first thing you're going to have is the site visit. There's a form for the site visit. You're actually going to the site and recording the conditions, and you're doing a contamination and toxic material worksheet that looks at both the subject property and the adjoining properties. And you're taking pictures and you're documenting everything around the site. You're basically creating your area of potential effect. And so then you would get into the statutory checklist items, starting with the historic preservation. And this is the Section 106 review, where you have consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office and also any relevant Indian tribes. Missouri does not have any federally recognized tribes, but there are tribes with an interest in Missouri. And then there's a website on the HUD Exchange. Sorry, it's not the HUD Exchange. It's called TDAT. There's a link on the HUD Exchange to it. There's also a link in our ER forms that will take you directly to these websites where you go to get this information for your ER. So if you follow the links, use the links in the forms as you're filling them out, it should take you to the correct website to help you document this information. And so you want to always keep whatever documentation you need in order to show that you did this consultation and that you checked the SHPO. You're just wanting to have in your file all your correspondence that you have between SHPO, and when you consult with the tribe, it needs to come, the correspondence needs to come from the chief elected official. So either the mayor or presiding commissioner would be the one that's signing off on this letter to the tribe. It has to be, you know, like government official to government official on that. And then if you get into where the tribe has, or the SHPO has a concern, there are additional steps that would have to be completed, such as they may request a cultural resource survey. And if they do that, you should include that in your ER record. You may have a memorandum of agreement or other stipulations to a project site that the tribe or SHPO has put in place. And so it's just important to keep all this documentation in your file. Flood insurance, you're going to have a format. FEMA has a website, a mapping website, where you can pull firm maps. Their flood insurance rate maps. And if they don't, so you need to have that or the best available flood data. I know FEMA is working with a contractor right now to update flood maps around the state. And so there may be something more recent than the firm. Some of the firms are pretty old, but you just want to make sure you have the most recent flood data in your ER record. And also proof of flood insurance if it's required. If it's an insurable structure, you need to have the proof of flood insurance. There should be like an NSIP listing that you can pull and let us know if the county or city is participating in the NFIP. And with all this, as you're going through these items, you are building out your conditions of approval, which Allison will talk about a little more later, but this is where you come up with mitigation to reduce any adverse impacts that you discover as you're going through the checklist. So the next one, floodplain management. This too, you should have a permit or the best available flood data in your file. Projects in floodways are almost always prohibited. Really only buyouts are something that's allowed in a floodway. And then wetland protection. This is where you would have your National Wetland Inventory map. And when you have maps for these items, there are several of these items where you want to print off a map. And the map should be in color, and they should have the boundaries of the project site identified. So you might have to draw it on there somehow. And then it should also show the project site boundary, and then in relation to like if you're a wetland, you know, you want to show it in proximity to where the wetland is. So it should be able to clearly tell where the project site is in proximity to a wetland. And that's important to document in your file. The other thing for wetland protection is an IPAC report, which you would find on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife website, and then probably have correspondence with the Army Corps of Engineers, because they require permits for work if it's inside a wetland or if it impacts a wetland in some way. Okay, next slide, please. So if you determine that the project site is located in a floodplain or wetland, or impacts a floodplain or wetland, you have to do the HUD 8-step decision-making process. And this, there's a couple of public notices that have to be published in this process. And Allison and I want to review your public notices before you print them, because they have certain requirements. And you also need to have proof of publication and proof of distribution in your file, so that we can see who all it was sent to. And the 8 steps, it has, of course, 8 steps, but it helps you find alternatives to doing work in the floodplain, and also mitigation, helps you develop mitigation of ways to reduce adverse impacts to floodplains and wetlands. coastal zone management, we do not have that in Missouri. So there's just a check box that you check for that. Airport hazards, this one you're showing a map indicating it's not within the threshold or not near an airport or at the end of a runway. Endangered species, this one, you would need the IPAC report and the Missouri Natural Heritage Report, which is on the Department of Conservation website. Both of these reports will give you a listing of potential endangered species habitats that are in your project area. And if it's found that there are some listed species, then you are to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Conservation to find out if they have any recommendations or requirements for your project. And so you just need to document all that consultation that took place. You want to include your reports, your IPAC and your natural heritage reports. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they have a effect determination tool on their website that will help you determine whether or not you need to consult with them. And for wild and scenic rivers, you would want to print off a map showing the project site in proximity to, there's only one wild and scenic river in the state. It's the 11-Point River in the southern part of the state. But then you also want to print off, there's a national rivers inventory, and make sure that the project is not going to adversely impact any of the rivers on that listing. I'm just looking at my form here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, for farmland protection, this would be anytime there's new construction or acquisition or converting one land use to another. There's questions you have to answer, and you should also print off a map of important farmland. There's a link on our form that takes you to this website. And if it shows that there are either prime farmland, unique farmland, or farmland of statewide or local importance, then you would consult with the NRCS, USDA NRCS, and all that documentation needs to be in your file. And for noise control, this is a factor anytime you have a noise sensitive land use. So if your project is for residential or a community center, library, a school, or shelter, those are all considered noise sensitive land use. And so you would have a map that shows major noise sources identified in proximity to the project site. And if necessary, there is a noise assessment on the HUD exchange that you would have to complete and document in your file. And for explosive and flammable hazards, this would have like photographs or maps of the project site and adjacent sites that show explosive and flammable hazards in the area. And then if there are any in the area within proximity to the project site, then you have to calculate the acceptable separation distance. And there's a calculator on the HUD exchange to do that. And then if it's found that the separation distance is unacceptable, then you have to add mitigation or move the project somewhere else or do something to get that that item away from the project. Okay, water quality has, Missouri has no sole source aquifers, and so this is not applicable to our state. Next slide, please. Air quality, this is where you're looking at air pollution and asbestos and mold, and you're going to be documenting the project area's attainment status, which is available on the EPA website, and if necessary, correspondence with DNR. And then if the project involves demolition or renovation of buildings or bridges or removal of asbestos water or sewer pipes, you may have to include an asbestos inspection. And then if asbestos-containing materials are present, they have to hire or contract with a Missouri registered asbestos abatement contractor. And then for mold, if you're doing rehab on a building with evidence of mold, you would want to take that in consideration. Contamination and toxic materials, this worksheet, you would need to complete one anytime if you have a fill, if you need fill or borrow material for a project, you have to complete a separate contamination and toxic material worksheet for the fill site. This form also requests that you explain previous uses of the project site, which is important just to document that there hasn't been any sort of contamination in the soil. And then you're looking at the area, pretty much a 1 mile radius of the project site to determine if there's any issues with contamination or toxic materials. And so you should be verifying this through several online database screens. There's links on our form, but you're looking at Superfunds, and the Department of Natural Resources has a site called eStart where you can do a screening, and you should print off the results of that and put it in your file. You're also looking at underground storage tanks in the area to see that there's no issue with those, or if the project is in a half mile of a landfill site. You're also looking at issues if there's any lead-based paint. If you're doing rehab, for example, you have to consider that there might be lead-based paint in the paint on the building that you're going to be rehabbing. So there's instructions for how to deal with that on the EPA website. And then once a project, if you have a new construction for residential or long-term occupancy of people such as schools, then you should implement radon mitigation probably do radon testing. So these are all things that can be added as conditions of approval to your project. Then the environmental justice is if there were any adverse environmental impacts identified in your ER up to this point. You have to consider how it impacts the area. And so you're just looking to make sure that there's nothing that adversely impacts disproportionately high for low income and or minority communities. Let's see. Next slide, please. Okay, for additional EA factors, this is an additional section that is in the environmental assessment. So it's not, and you're not going to find this in the exempt or the CEST or the CENST forms, but for only the environmental assessment. And if you use the impact determination guide, there is information about this section, and there's questions in our form that should help guide you as to what to consider in this section. But basically, you're looking at 4 areas. So the land development, you're looking at, your soil suitability. You want the project to conform with community plans, and to take into consideration erosion control measures. So you're not creating problems with it. You want to make sure that it's compatible land use and that it is compatible with the zoning in the area. You want to make sure that the slope is not going to create a problem, so that it has proper drainage. You're also looking at hazards and nuisances, including site safety and noise, and energy consumption of the project itself. You're also looking at employment and income patterns, whether the project will significantly increase or decrease employment opportunities, if it's going to have any changes to the demographic character of the community. Also displacement, whether or not the project will cause displacement. And you're looking at the availability of community services. So you're looking at commercial facilities, healthcare, social services, solid waste, disposal and recycling, wastewater and water supply, and public safety, just to make sure that there's not an adverse impact to any of these community services. And socioeconomic factors. And also natural facilities. So how will the project impact wildlife in the area, the water quality, and vegetation? Okay, so is there any questions up to this point? Okay.
Kim, are you all going to cover, sorry, we had one question in the chat and I think that you all might be covering it later on, but I just wanted to check about like possibly tiered environmental reviews. Is that going to be covered?
Yes, Allison
okay.
will cover that. And actually, I'm going to turn it over to Allison now for the next slide, the conditions of approval or for approval.
Good morning. Conditions of approval are key in an environmental report. They have minimization, mitigation, and avoidance measures in them. Key questions to ask are what, how, who, and when is to be done, including where and why. If you have, for example, a condition of approval, if you have excavation in an area that's been farmed, you could continue to have excavation there, but if you were to do excavation outside that area, you would need an archaeological survey and it would need to be submitted to SHPO for approval prior to any work taking place. This should be put in the contract documents, and the environmental preparer or the project administrator shall perform a site visit to check on this condition of approval. It's really important to emphasize compliance with the conditions of approval to check that these minimization, mitigation, and avoidance measures are adhered to. Next slide. The next stage in our environmental timeline is once we have applicable clearances from all the state, federal agencies and tribes and the environmental forms have been completed, the grantee or the local government reviews and signs the environmental report, and the grant administrator then submits it to the Department of Economic Development. Then the department will review the environmental report with the grant administrator, and they will exchange feedback with each other until there is a satisfactory environmental report. Next slide. Could we go back a slide? So the public notices get submitted to the department for review, and then they get published once they're approved. Then the next stage is that public notice is sent to state and federal agencies and tribes. And during that period, there's a local comment period that's observed, and then all these comments that come in from the public or any state and federal agencies or tribes get addressed. Next slide. So again, the public notice gets submitted to the Department of Economic Development. We have different publication periods, comment periods. For the CEST, it's 7 days. But if it's posted, it's 10 days. And similarly with the environmental assessment, it's 15 days comment period, and it's 18 days if it gets posted. And it's important to get an affidavit of publication when you're going through the public notice period. And then this notice gets sent to tribes and the agencies, federal and state agencies. Next slide, please. The next stage is the request for release of funds gets submitted to the state. And along with that is the affidavit of publication and the proof of distribution to the state and federal agencies and tribes that must be submitted to the state. And then after that is the state observance period, objection period, and that's 15 days. After 15 days has elapsed, then the authority to use grant funds is issued by the state, or a pre-grant approval is issued. And this goes to both the grantee and the grant administrator with a copy of the conditions of approval. After that, then the project begins. Next slide. Previous slide. There we go. To go over the request for release of funds, you need a thorough project description, and you have a front and back page. It needs to be a signed original copy. You send the request for release of funds and the affidavit of publication along with the proof of distribution to the federal and state agencies and tribes that took place. You send that to the state. We're accepting emails of the request for release of funds at this point. It's important to note that the state objection period begins the day after we receive the request for release of funds. And you should retain an original copy of the request for release of funds that you email to the state. Next slide. So comment periods, we have a variety of them. With the 8-step process for floodplains and wetlands, we have 2 notices, an early notice and a final notice called notice of explanation. The early notice is 15 days and the final notice is 7 days. The notice of intent is for CESTs and they are 15 days. The combined notice is for notice of intent and FONSI, and that's for an environmental assessment. So this is how this would work. If you published on the 6th, you would start counting your 15-day comment period. The first day would start on the 7th, and then it would end on the 21st. And since that was a Saturday, you would carry it over 1 extra day. So then on the 24th, you would submit your request for release of funds and certification. The day after is when you begin your state objection period, and that is 15 days. So that starts on the 25th. Next slide. So as the project is completed, the grantee documents compliance with all conditions of approval. And then at project closeout, the Department of Economic Development will monitor this file for compliance with the environmental report and will look for signed forms and compliance with all conditions of approval. Next slide. So we have special circumstances we're going to go over. So we had someone ask about tiered reviews. We have, in a tiered review, we have it when it's appropriate when evaluating a proposal at early stages of development or when site-specific analysis is not yet feasible. Tiered reviews are appropriate, for example, scattered site buyouts and rehab. A buyout example would be if you had a flood-prone area, it would be ideal to have properties purchased and demolished to get them out of the floodplain. Similarly, with a rehab project, if you had an area that was hit by a tornado, there would need to be rehabilitation to take place. Next slide. So at the tier 1, it's defined as a broad review over maximum anticipated project scope and geographic area. So you resolve your compliance for all laws and authorities possible. So that would be 24 CFR 58.5 and 58.6. Those are the laws and authorities. You establish a plan at this tier 1 for the site-specific review. And the site-specific review is a tier 2. So it would be issues where compliance could not be determined at the broad tier 1 level. So you would define strategies and procedures to determine compliance and mitigate impacts for this tier 2 level. Your plan must include limitations to ensure no activities or sites will have a significant environmental impact at the tier 2 level. So with tier 1, unlike with tier 2, you publish your public notice, either your NOI, notice of intent, or your NOI FONSI, and then you submit to the state the RROF and the certification. Next slide.
Allison, we have a question really quickly before we move on.
Sure.
Can you state again, I can't remember if that's what you stated or not, what the CFR for tier 1 is?
The Code of Federal Regulations for tier 1?
Mm-hmm.
There was like a previous slide. I mentioned regulations 24 CFR 58.5 and 58.6.
Those are the applicable? Okay,
Yes.
Kim's answered it here. Okay, great, thank you.
So I don't know, did we leave off at tier 1? Let's go back a slide to make sure that we covered it. Oh, yes. So we publish a public notice and request for release of funds is submitted to the state. And this is at a tier 1, unlike at a tier 2. Next slide. So this is the site-specific review level, and it must address all sections where compliance couldn't be determined in the tier 1 level. And as I said, there's no public notice or request or release of funds required unless it's unanticipated impacts or impacts that are not adequately addressed in the prior review, meaning the tier 1 review. And I'll give you some examples of tiering of how the tier 1 and tier 2 apply. If you have endangered species in an IPAC report, of Fish and Wildlife Service IPAC report, that would be at a tier 1 level where it shows endangered species at a large area, like at a city level. Now, if you wanted to know if endangered species were on a specific project site, you would then fall into a tier 2. You would be doing a biological survey to determine if there's any endangered species present at the site-specific level, at the project level for your specific area. And if you found endangered species, let's say you had endangered bats, you would maintain the trees as a condition of approval. That would be a mitigation measure that you would do after you did your tier 2. Another example would be if you found contamination at a large scale. For example, there was a Superfund site, and that would be tier 1. Tier 2 would be at your site-specific level, you check for contamination by doing a phase 1 ESA to check. And let's say there were contaminants found, you would do mitigation measures. Another example would be the presence of wetlands. Let's say at a large scale you found wetlands present, through the Fish and Wildlife Service. That would be at Tier 1 level. Tier 2 would be doing a jurisdictional determination on the property to determine if wetlands are present. And that would be your site-specific analysis. Next slide. Should I ask if there's any questions on tiering at this point? The person that had a question on tiering? Okay, we'll proceed to special circumstances regarding ER adoption. So the CDBG DR program will accept FEMA environmental reviews without anything else being required or additional comment periods. But there must be a request in writing from HUD. Similarly, the CDBG mitigation program will allow adoption of an environmental review from any federal agency, but there must also be a request in writing from HUD. For projects that are co-funded by multifamily housing projects, for example, CDBG DR program will accept the Missouri Housing Development Corporation's environmental review, and the Department of Economic Development will act as a responsible entity in these circumstances. Next slide. Special circumstances updating the ER are, so this would be when you have new activities that have been added, unexpected conditions that arise, substantial changes made to the nature, magnitude, or extent of the project. So this is when changes develop in the existing project. Now, if there's substantial changes, you could have to do a new ER. With the ER amendment, there is a packet, special packet, and there's an amendment form. There's new worksheets and documentation that need to be done. And with the ERR amendment, it's important to note that the changes in the amendment must fall within the original scope of the project. An example of an ER amendment would be a street overlay project. It's, let's say, is the original project. And let's say there's a request to add additional streets. Well, that would be the amendment. Now, if you tell it if it's an appropriate amendment is if the streets fall within the original geographic area of the project, then it would be okay to have an amendment. Things to look for with amendments, you need to ask if the finding is still valid. Is it still a CEST or is an EA needed? Are there additional conditions of approval needed? Is it still a FONSI if it's an EA? Does it have the same findings with the statutory checklist? Are the compliance determinations the same? Another example of updating the ER would be adding fill material. SHPO and Tribe would need to be contacted and a contamination and toxic materials worksheet would need to be filled out. Next slide. Another special circumstance would be borrow sites. If fill is required, it needs to be included in the original project scope. All borrow sites must have environmental clearance, and that would mean a site visit, a section 106 if applicable, and a contamination and evaluation worksheet. If ground disturbance is required, section 106 is required. So SHPO and tribal consultation would need to take place. So there would need to be a 30-day elapse period for the consultation with this. If there was quarry material where the quarry is not being expanded, where there's no ground disturbance, SHPO should still be notified. Next slide. So what to remember is that the environmental report is on hold until the project is complete. And it's important to start early to look at mitigation measures, conditions of approval, options, alternatives. And normally it takes 90 to 120 days to do an environmental review. Another thing to take into account is if there's a change of scope and project might change the review required. And CDBG staff are always here and available to you. Next slide. For intake applications and Tier 2 level reviews, should use a preliminary screening to ensure the project site is environmentally compliant or that mitigation is cost reasonable. Some issues to watch out for: noise, for example. A noise-sensitive land use would be a residential area or a nursing home. That would be important to watch out for. Is the noise level more than 65 decibels? Explosives. Are there any above-ground storage tanks with hazardous liquids and gases within a mile of the site? If so, an acceptable separation distance would need to be determined. That is, acceptable distance between chemicals and people. Contamination. Is there radon present? Are there lead in buildings? Are there any other contaminants present? Is there an underground storage tank on the site? Is the project within a mile of a Superfund site? If so, a Phase 1 ESA would need to be done. Floodplains and wetlands. Does a wetland jurisdictional determination need to be done? Does the building require elevation out of the floodplain? Endangered species. Is a biological survey needed? Historic resources. Is a cultural survey needed? These would be examples of Tier 2 level reviews where you have specific studies done at the site-specific level. Next slide. Recommendations for success. Kim talked about reading the administrative manual, and the impact determination guide. These are really great resources. It's important to use current forms and sources because our forms get updated. And it's important to check on current information with state and federal agency websites. Be proactive and not reactive. It's important to see the site, to not do armchair environmental review, but to actually go out and look at the site and identify challenges at this stage. Explain the ER process to all parties and keep them informed. It's important to have communication. It's ideal to do it well the first time to reduce work and delays. Proofread your work. Have attention to details. Explain in your environmental report with detailed and concise responses. And contact us if you have any questions or if the project scope changes. Next slide. We have some resources here, and you can contact us if you can't copy this down, but we have a link for environmental review forms, packets, and resources. We recommend the HUD Exchange. That's got a wealth of information on the environmental review process. And if you type in WISER in the HUD Exchange, you will get training videos on all the statutory checklist items. And I'd be happy to answer any questions as well as Kim.
So I don't see anything in the chat right now. Everybody, feel free to unmute yourself if you have anything. or feel free to type into the chat and we'll stay tuned for a couple of minutes here. Otherwise, we'll give you all about 20 minutes of your lives back.
Hey, Amy, this is Chris
Okay.
at Ozark Foothills Regional Planning Commission.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just had a question about the level of environmental review required for some of the MIT projects. For example, the generator projects and the storm siren or warning siren projects. Would those be a finding of exemption, or how should we go about the environmental work on that?
Did you want to take that, Kim?
Well, I'm wondering, with the storm siren, are you having to do any digging?
No, it would just be, well, I say no. In some cases, the storm sirens will be updated so that they have more reach and impact. So, you know, it would just be an equipment replacement. I think we have one project where a new storm siren would be added, but it's my understanding that these grants only cover the equipment purchase and not the related construction costs. And the same with the generators. We're just requesting a grant for the equipment and not for the installation.
I would say it'd probably be a CENST because that includes equipment and supplies. Let me see here. Or, well, it may be CEFT. Repair improvement of public facilities when they're in place and will be retained without change in size or capacity more than 20%. That might be a better fit, actually.
So subject to?
Subject to, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat. When does the ER need to be done, prior to the application or after award / prior to the use of funds?
It can be done either, whatever, I guess, makes the most sense for the project, because I know, like, with the MUC projects, don't they have the ERs done, you know, before they go to the MUC committee or before they're applied for?
Most of the time they're done. The standard that we always say is, you know, get started on it before the application for sure, and start doing some of the letters and contacts the agencies. But we don't have a requirement that I'm aware of that anything has to be done yet before.
Yeah, I would say you want to get an early start on it for sure, especially for an EA level, because it's going to take, you know, 3 to 4 months to complete.
We have projects that haven't been funded yet, and we start on the environmental review, so it can start like very early.
Yeah, because we do pre-grant approvals on some projects, so they're not funded yet, but you know, the ER is complete.
Question related to that: if this is Lincoln Brown at Mi'kmaq RPC, if an ER, is that something that can be reimbursed? Because there's quite a bit of time and money really invested in, if you're going to do it prior to the application, prior to a grant award. Is that something that can be reimbursed?
Amy, you want to take that one?
I was going to say, I'll answer that one, Lincoln. Yes, these specifically, these mitigation and disaster recovery programs, we are allowing for pre-award costs, and an environmental review is determined as an activity delivery cost. So that would absolutely be a reimbursable thing as long as the application was approved for and awarded funding.
And I'm assuming if they were procured correctly.
Obviously, yes. Do you want to ask your other question while you're unmuted, Lincoln, or do you want me to read it from the chat?
Oh, I think this kind of related to somebody else's question about what the environmental covers. And it was my understanding that it covers all aspects of a project, whether, if CDBG money is involved in just a portion of it, the environmental needs to cover all components of it, even if there are parts of it that are privately funded. But that was my understanding.
Yeah, the project description includes all funding sources.
Thank you.
Great questions. Just so I can make situational awareness that for the mitigation, can one of you speak towards the allowance for accepting other federal agency environmental reviews for mitigation?
Yeah, they're all accepted, and Kim, correct me if I'm wrong, as long as there's writing permission granted by HUD in writing.
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be like part of, like their funding, say, for example, FEMA's funding, the federal share, and then we're going in as match. So it's the same scope. But Allison's correct. It has to have HUD approval first.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, so we'll give everybody just another minute or two, and then we could end if nobody else has any questions. It must just mean you all did a fabulous job, and there's nothing else to ask.
Please contact us if you have any questions that arise.
Yeah. And I want to thank everybody for their time today to attend this. It's so overwhelmingly complex. It is. I do a lot.
That's obviously not the right thing, Lincoln.
I spend a lot of time doing research, reading about these requirements. So it is very complex.
And all questions are good.
Yes, no question is a dumb question. So, all right, well, I think that will wrap it up for everything. So again, if you have any other questions you think of later, feel free to contact Kim or Allison. And then be on the lookout for this presentation being on the website. Hopefully today, possibly Tuesday. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.